It begins with a small moment, almost invisible. An American standing in an Australian cafe, glancing at the clock, then glancing again at the people around them. No one is rushing. No one looks stressed. The barista is chatting. The coffee is taking its time. And for a brief second, the American wonders if something has gone wrong, if there's been a power cut, if productivity has quietly died. Because back home, this would feel irresponsible. Here, it feels normal. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. That's usually the first crack in the assumption. The idea that Australia will feel just like the United States, only with better beaches and stranger animals. Same language, same movies, same brands, same Western world. But within days, sometimes hours, that assumption collapses. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough to be unsettling. Most Americans arrive in Australia expecting familiarity. They've grown up watching it on television, hearing the accent in films, seeing it described as America's laid-back cousin, a place that looks similar, talks similar, and should therefore function in roughly the same. What they don't expect is to feel, almost immediately, that something fundamental is different. Not on the surface, deeper than that. It starts with time. In Australia, time doesn't chase people in quite the same way. Work ends and people actually leave. Emails can wait. Shops close early without apology. Weekends belong to everyone, not just the wealthy or the lucky. To Australians, this feels unremarkable. To many Americans, it feels suspicious, as if society is getting away with something it shouldn't be allowed to. There's a moment many Americans describe when they realize they're not constantly bracing themselves, not for danger exactly, just for pressure. The pressure to optimize every hour, to turn rest into productivity, to justify relaxation with achievement. In Australia, no one asks what you're doing with your downtime. Downtime simply exists. Public spaces reveal this difference immediately. Parks are full. Beaches are accessible. You don't need a reason to be there. You don't need to buy anything. You're not expected to move along once you've stopped spending money. People gather without purpose. They sit, they talk, they leave when they feel like it. For Americans, raised in a culture where space is often commercialized and time monetized, this can feel oddly liberating and oddly uncomfortable. Then there's safety, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that makes headlines, the quiet kind, the assumption that you can walk home at night without constantly scanning, that children can take public transport, that police aren't an ever-present psychological weight in everyday life. Australians don't talk about this much, which in itself says everything. Americans notice it in the way conversations unfold. There's less tension, less defensiveness, less sense that everyone is one bad day away from conflict. Disagreements happen, but they don't escalate as quickly. Authority exists, but it isn't worshipped or feared in the same way. It's just there. Slightly annoying, occasionally necessary, rarely dramatic. Healthcare often becomes the turning point, not the system itself, but the mindset around it. Australians don't talk about medical care as a privilege or a personal victory. It's treated as infrastructure, like roads or electricity, something imperfect, sometimes frustrating, but fundamentally expected. Americans, conditioned to calculate costs and consequences before seeking help, often struggle to switch off that internal alarm. The idea that you can be ill without being financially punished feels to them like bending the rules of reality. At first, it feels like a holiday illusion. The sun, the novelty, the distance from home. Americans tell themselves it can't be real, that it must fade once normal life kicks in. But then weeks pass, and the feeling doesn't disappear. Instead, it deepens. This is usually when the emotional shift happens. The moment when an American realizes they're sleeping better, laughing more easily, checking their phone less, feeling lighter in ways they didn't know how to articulate back home. It's not happiness exactly, it's absence. The absence of constant low-grade anxiety. The absence of being perpetually on edge. For Australians and Brits watching this unfold, there's a quiet recognition. Not smugness, just understanding. This is how life feels when it isn't turned up to maximum volume all the time, when success isn't treated like a moral obligation, when your worth isn't measured by exhaustion. The comparison becomes unavoidable, not because Australia is perfect, it isn't, but because the differences expose things Americans have been taught to normalize. Long hours, minimal leave, hustle as identity, stress as status. In Australia, working yourself into the ground isn't admired, it's questioned. Sometimes gently, sometimes mercilessly. Friendships form differently too. They're slower, less transactional. People don't ask what you do within the first 5 minutes. They ask where you're from, whether you like it here, whether you've been burned by the sun yet. The hierarchy feels flatter. Titles matter less. Confidence is understated. Trying too hard is often the only real social crime. For many Americans, this is where the idea of freedom quietly shifts. Back home, freedom is often described as choice. More options, more speed, more access. In Australia, freedom feels more like permission. Permission to stop, to exist without justification, to live a life that doesn't need to constantly prove itself. But then comes the twist, because Australia isn't a fantasy. And eventually, the things Americans miss begin to surface. Convenience, for one. Australia closes early. Shops shut, services pause. There's less instant gratification, less 2-4-hour availability. For Americans used to everything being on demand, this can feel frustrating, sometimes infuriating. There's also distance. Australia is far from everywhere. Visiting home isn't a weekend decision. Time zones are unforgiving. Familiar holidays feel muted. Cultural references don't always land. The humor is drier. The sarcasm cuts differently. Americans who thrive on enthusiasm sometimes feel out of step in a culture that values understatement and eye-rolling restraint. Career ambition can feel slower too. Progress exists, but it doesn't shout about itself. There's less spectacle around success. Less theater. For some Americans, this feels calming. For others, stifling. The system isn't designed to reward relentless self-promotion, which can be a shock if that's how you've learned to survive. And yet, even with these challenges, many Americans don't want to go back. Or at least, not in the same way. Because once you've experienced a society where life isn't permanently accelerated, it's hard to forget what that feels like. This is where the question begins to form. Quietly, uncomfortably. What is freedom, really? Is it the ability to do everything, all the time, without pause? Or is it the ability to stop without fear? Is it choice without safety? Or safety without spectacle? Australians and Brits don't tend to define freedom out loud. They live it in smaller ways. Through time off. Through public trust. Through the assumption that life shouldn't hurt just to be meaningful. Americans experiencing this for the first time often struggle to put it into words. They don't feel like they've lost anything. They feel like they've gained space. Mental space, emotional space, the space to exist without constantly negotiating with the system around them. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that Australia feels freer, but that it makes you question what you were carrying before. Stress you thought was normal. Pressure you assumed was inevitable. A way of living that never paused long enough to be examined. In the end, no country has a monopoly on freedom. Australia has its flaws. America has its strengths. But when Americans experience life in Australia, many of them don't just see another country. They see an alternative rhythm, a quieter version of modern life, one that doesn't demand everything all the time. And once you've felt that rhythm, even briefly, it stays with you. Long after the coffee goes cold, long after the beach sunsets fade, it lingers as a question you can't unask. If life can feel like this here, why doesn't it feel like this everywhere?